This is an interview with Charles Lester for the Georgia Legal Services Program Oral History Project, recorded at his conference room at Sutherland Asheville.
Asheville and Brennan.
And Brennan, I'm sorry.
Sorry?
On the 29th of April. I would like to know a little bit about your background and your family. I knew you grew up in the Decatur and the Emory area and had connections, but sort of what was sort of the trajectory that led you to legal aid and legal services to begin with?
Well, I don't know that I can trace it all the way back to Emory, but my father taught at Emory, and I grew up on the Emory campus, living there from the time I was 6 months old, and close by, even after we moved out of faculty housing into a house in Decatur. And so I was active at Emory. My aunt and my mother were, my aunt was Ruth Boozer, Jack Boozer's wife, and right. Jack Boozer was real active in a lot of stuff in the community various times, and including some activity in the integration of Emory. Actually, my dad and my uncle were sort of on a faculty senate committee that went to the chairman of the board and said, you know, this was during the time when, after Brown versus Board of Education, when the issue of whether we would continue to have a public education system, either higher or lower education, and private schools weren't allowed to integrate, that they said, Emory needs to do something about this. And I'm not saying they had a pivotal role in it, but they may have had some small role in convincing Emory to ultimately sue, which they did, and get permission to integrate. My mother and aunt were both active in an organization called the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which, at least in its Atlanta chapter, was principally concerned with integration and had a number of members, including Mrs. Martin Luther King Sr. and Mrs. Benjamin Mays and Mrs. Stamps. I think it was Stanley
Albert.
The Spelman College president.
Manley,
Mrs. Manley. And they met, once a month or 5 or 6 times a year at the homes of various members, and they met at my house before, and so my mother knew them, and she was interested in, and I guess got me interested in issues related to that. My father was also somewhat involved in it because after, later in his career, he became an administrator, and he had a lot of dealings with administrators at the predominantly black hospitals in Atlanta as well.
What about people associated with Emory, like John Griffin or James Mackey?
I knew Jimmy Mackey very well. He and Daddy were big friends, and Mr. Mackey was a member of our church, and I was a member of Mormon Methodist Church, and so I saw and was exposed to him as well, and that had some influence on me. Then the other thing that got me to legal services, I think, was the policy that Emory Law School had when I graduated, which was in class of 67, and they required, I think it was 20 hours that you had to spend just sometime in your last year in law school working at Atlanta Legal Aid. And so it actually occurred that back then you didn't have to be you didn't have to graduate past to take the bar. So I took the bar in the summer before I graduated and actually was admitted in December. And so I was actually a lawyer and got to do lawyerly things for Atlanta Legal Aid, and I handled a couple of divorce cases and a bastardy case, and enjoyed the work. Then after law school, I went into the Navy, and when I came back to Atlanta, there was a lawyer here in the Sutherland office who was running the South Side Saturday Lawyers program. And he recruited me to be a Saturday lawyer, and I did it either in the fall of 70, although I think it's probably more likely in the spring of 71. I actually still have some clients that I met at that very first time I did Saturday lawyer. At least one, Mr. Freeman, who must be 100 years old by now. And then he left the firm, and I sort of inherited first the Southside office of the Saturday Lawyer Program, and then the whole Atlanta Legal Aid Saturday Lawyer Program, administering it. And then I started, Michael Terry got me on the board of Atlanta Legal Aid, and I ultimately worked my way up to the executive committee and then to be president. I think I was that in '78.
Of Atlanta Legal Aid.
Of Atlanta Legal Aid.
Can you describe the Saturday program?
The Saturday Lawyers Program at that time, which it still exists, although a little different, but at that time it was administered by the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, and you went to an office of Atlanta Legal Aid, and they made interviews for you to talk to 5 or 6 people, and you talked to them and tried to help them and took their case, however long that took. In the case of that first time, Ms. Freeman, that I took the case of, had worked at the Atlanta Municipal Market down near Grady Hospital, Georgia State, and had never been paid her Social Security had never been paid by her employer, and she was eligible to retire, and she had been turned down for Social Security. So I prepared the materials, and we had a hearing in front of the administrative officer, and she got a big lump sum payment, I think $6,000 or $7,000, as I remember, and got on Social Security, and that was in the summer of 1971, and I've represented her and several of her children and grandchildren and others since then.
So, how did you gain sort of the administrative experience to sort of run the Southside branch?
I don't know that I had any administrative experience to do it, but I mean, basically what we did, at the Southside is that law firm, we had 2 or 3 law firms, and they would go maybe once a month. You would, a couple of times a year, you would have to try to recruit 4 or 5 lawyers, 3 or 4 lawyers to come down on that Saturday and interview clients and take their cases and follow up. And then there were conflicts and problems. You had to sort of, help out and be the contact person.
I know there's a lot of overlap between the Legal Aid, Atlanta Legal Aid, and Georgia Indigent Legal Services, and then Georgia Legal Services. But so, how did you personally kind of get from the one to the other organization?
Well, John Cromarty was a fraternity brother of mine at Emory. He actually went to Georgia Law School, but he and I were Phi Delta Theta fraternities at Emory, and John and I have been and remained close friends. And sometime in the early 70s, he came to me and asked me if I would serve as the treasurer of Georgia Indigent Legal Services, and I agreed to do it. And I served it for a number of years. I don't remember exactly how many. I don't remember exactly when it occurred, but at one time, Georgia Indigent Legal Services was the principal statewide provider of legal services. It had a contract through the poverty program, and it was funded in part by state money. The state, they decided they needed to sue the state for some welfare-related issue. I don't remember the details of it right now, but as a result of that, they lost their state funding. But Gills and Georgia Legal Services sort of took over, and out of the legal services movement, got money from the Legal Services Corporation. But the one thing that Gills had was it had a telephone connected system. I think it was a long distance system through the state of Georgia, and it kept that for a long time after it lost its funding. So we maintained the existence of Gills, at least in part, to take advantage of that opportunity for the statewide legal services program.
So even though it had lost its funding, it hadn't lost its phone line.
That's right. And
no one was going to tell
and
it.
then not too much longer after that, and I don't remember exactly when, but I would say about the time that I was cutting back on my work from Atlanta Legal Aid, I got on the Georgia Legal Services Board, and I served on that board for off and on, I think, since the late 70s or something like that. Up through last year. I'm off this year, but
Okay. Well, let's maybe start mid-70s and go forward. Were you associated with Legal Services before the Legal Services Corporation or after?
I believe before.
Okay. And do you remember any of these early budget battles you must have as treasurer?
Oh, yeah.
And what?
Well, I mean, we, I think when Georgia Legal Services first got its money, it was a lot, and they added a lot of offices and added a lot of people. I mean, in retrospect, it probably doesn't seem that much, but it seems to me like it was $2 a full person or $4 a full person or some number like that that really increased their budget rapidly, and they made a very big expansion. But then over time, when the attacks came and the budget cuts came, there was just awful lot of agony and troubles over having to cut the budget and lay people off and close offices. And we met and talked about that frequently.
Where were the attacks coming from?
Well, they were principally coming from conservative and primarily Republican legislators in Congress and the Senate.
You're talking nationally.
Nationally.
Part of it in the Nixon.
Right. In the really almost in the post-Nixon era. I mean, it wasn't too bad during Jimmy Carter's time, but in the Reagan era in particular, we had tremendous problems with cutbacks in funds.
Okay, well, why don't we talk? I think it'd be useful in the time that we have to talk about sort of the various challenges to legal services, both statewide and nationally, and then the responses to those challenges on the part of the board, on the part of Georgia Legal Services, on the part of sort of the advocacy community.
Well, I think there were, tremendous challenges that occurred first in the state funding when Gills lost his funding, and that was somewhat offset by the Legal Services Corporation creation during the Nixon years and the support it received initially both when Nixon was president and then during the Carter administration. But it was a problem, and it clearly was a problem at the time it came up, and it always sort of threatened the relationship. And one other sort of related problem is the bar relationship with Gills has generally been pretty good on the leadership level, and for the most part been pretty good statewide. But from time to time, members of the bar would be concerned about legal services activities, either aggressive class action or other type lawsuits, or really, in some cases, concerned that legal services lawyers were handling matters that could and should be handled by private lawyers, particularly in smaller and rural settings. And so that was a constant. But one of the things that occurred as a result of the attack was that the leadership of legal services, and I think this is true nationwide, but also locally, both Atlanta Legal Aid and Georgia Legal Services realized how important a role the bar had and how much the leaders benefited if they really cultivated the bar, if they went to the meetings, if they participated in the activities of the bar, and really helped the bar understand what kind of, the value and importance of legal services, provided a mechanism for complaints to be received and responded to, and take advantage of how much easier it is to work with somebody if you know who they are rather than if you don't know who they are. And I think almost every time there was a challenge, the legal services community ultimately got some benefit from it, even though it may have been hurt by the challenge, because it strengthened its ties with the bar. It created new opportunities. I'll give a perfect example.
Sure.
For Georgia Legal Services, it had never been able to raise any money from the bar as a whole. And I don't remember exactly when it was, but it's in the 1980s, early 1980s. Shortly after Mike Bowers was added to the board, which I think was in the, like late 70s, early 80s, he was the Attorney General of Georgia. He made the motion for the first statewide bar campaign to support Georgia Legal Services. And it it has over the years grown. I mean, it's not huge, but it's up over $200,000, close to $300,000, I believe, maybe even over $300,000 the last year. That is raised by a solicitation where lawyers can designate a part of their dues to go to Georgia Legal Services, or they can actually just make a check contribution for it. And it has both helped provide some resources that otherwise weren't available, and it's also helped with improved relations between the bar and strengthen the bar support for the legal services group. A somewhat similar event has occurred in Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta Legal Aid Atlanta has much more concentrated lawyers, bigger law firms, and therefore bigger resources, but they've also benefited from a bar program which now generates $1 million a year for them in funding. And sort of out of that even, I mean, another example of the funding that both legal services programs have gotten through the state for domestic violence work was primarily and exclusively the idea of a president of the bar, and the relationship with the bar and the bar's ability to support and encourage that and get the support of the judiciary and the governor and the legislature and actually get over $1 million. I don't remember, that's up pretty close to $2 million, I think, to the two legal services programs.
Who was that and how did
that was Linda Klein as the president of the bar, and it happened, let's see, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And that whole funding, which is an annual appropriation by the state bar, I think it's administered by the Administrative Office of the Courts, and they have a contract, I believe they have a contract actually with the legal services programs to provide domestic violence assistance to poor people.
What is, was that in response to the 94 Republican?
It was partly that. I mean, it was one, there was a big concern about domestic violence and its impact, but two, it was also a way of getting resources that wouldn't have happened but for the need and the thought of how we deal with this problem. How can we respond to this cutback with some creative event? Of course, another big activity that the bar had a role in was the creation of the Georgia Bar Foundation and the Interest on Lawyer Trust Funds. Not that we were unique in that concept at all. I mean, there were other states that started it before we did, but clearly but for the good relationship that the legal services programs had with the bar and the recognition of the need and the concern from the cutbacks, that those programs wouldn't have been created, and once created wouldn't have been expanded to the level at which they are now.
Can you talk about how IOLTA came about? Sort of how it works and sort of...
All right. It's basically what it is that lawyers hold a lot of money for clients, and they hold it in escrow accounts. Sometimes the accounts are held, the money is held for so short a period of time, or the amount held is so small that there's no practical way to collect interest on that money, or the interest that would be collected would be more than offset by fees assessed for the opening of an interest-bearing account. And so what the Interest on Lawyer Trust Fund is a rule adopted by the Supreme Court which says that for those monies that are either held a short period of time or small, so that there wouldn't be a net interest earned for the client, that money would go to the Georgia Bar Foundation and could be used by the Bar Foundation for various public service and public interest activities, including legal services. And I think it was an idea that I think the origin of it is Florida and Texas. But one of my partners, John Chandler, was instrumental in going to the state bar and the court and urging them to first adopt a opt-out sort of system, which would be a voluntary, where the lawyers could participate in unless they decided not to. and then ultimately they made it mandatory over time. And
So every attorney,
who holds money for a client that is held for a short period of time or for or that is so small that the interest generated from that couldn't be assigned to the client, must put that money into an interest-bearing account that pays that interest over to the State Bar to administer for the benefit of public service activities, including legal services. And the two legal services programs are the largest, not the only beneficiaries, but the largest beneficiaries of the IOLTA monies.
didn't Judge Shube also
Oh, yes.
tell me that story?
Judge Shube has done another thing that has benefited. Sometimes in class actions, there is a funding formula to pay to the class members a certain amount of money, and sometimes you can't find them. It literally, and so after a period of time, there will be money left in the account and no real person to give it to. And under those circumstances, courts have used a concept called cy-pres, which really gives a court the right to adjust a trust sort of consistent with the objectives of its origin when it doesn't work. And in this case, it was an airport, it was a dispute between airlines and customers over, I think, how agents handled ticket costs, and there was a refund which gave various benefits to class members, and there was several $1 million left over. And Judge Shube decided to distribute that money to various entities, and Georgia Legal Services and Atlanta Legal Aid each got $1 million to use as they wanted in support of their legal services commitments. And in each case, what they did was set up a foundation to hold that money and to hopefully maybe add to it with endowment or other funds and use the interest earned rather than the principal to benefit the program. And Georgia Legal Services has a foundation that was the result of that cy-pres money.
What have been sort of the major obstacles that, you've seen Georgia Legal Services face, challenges, crises, whatever, external, internal?
Well, we have a really big state. People don't realize how big it is because they don't drive in it much, but it's the largest state in land area east of the Mississippi. And it's very different. The metropolitan Atlanta area is very different from some of the rural areas. And Georgia Legal Services, the real challenge for delivery of services is the diversity of the state and the size of the state. And I think, they really need a lot more resources to do even a barely adequate job at helping people who need to be helped and have needs. When I was president of the State Bar, the ABA was doing a survey of legal needs, and I convinced the leadership of the bar and sections and a lot of other organizations to get Georgia to do a sort of a parallel survey, which would take advantage of the surveying that was being done nationally and use the same format and do some special surveying in Georgia. And that survey showed that only about 20% of the needs of poor people were being met currently. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's a real challenge for Georgia Legal Services to do. And because it is a big organization in terms of number of offices and people, keeping it and managing it, administering it is a tremendous challenge. I think the administrators do very well, and we're fortunate to keep lawyers and keep them really a fairly long time, particularly considering how little we pay them. But that's a real delivery system nightmare. And if you impose on top of that the really unreasonable sort of rules that Congress proposed when they imposed the last restrictions on legal services, restrictions about representing undocumented aliens, about bringing class actions, about prison conditions, about welfare and other kinds of things, really makes the work much less attractive, much less interesting to the lawyers that are doing it. Not that it isn't still very important, but those are very big challenges. And then, sort of another major challenge is just the whole, information challenge. I mean, both having people know and understand what legal services lawyers do and how valuable and important they are to our system. I mean, I really think they're sort of the heroes, because what they do is really keep people honest, whether it's government or whether it's private citizens. If it wasn't for legal services, there's just no telling what would happen to people who are powerless. So I think those are the real major challenges.
Do you remember the Savannah suit? Were you around when this Savannah-based suit?
I was, although most of I remember it most out of the context of Atlanta Legal Aid rather than out of Georgia Legal Services. But I was very familiar with it, with the whole concept of it, and I actually knew a lot of the parties. I know the lawyer who was the plaintiff. And
Joe
Bergen. Yeah, I've had deals with Joe, and I've in fact very pleasant dealings, even though he's a tiger of a lawyer. And I knew Mike Doyle in particular was an officer in Atlanta Legal Aid, he was president a year or two ahead of me, and so I knew him, and of course I knew John, and I knew what was the woman's name? Who was the director then?
Betty Kerr?
Yeah, Betty Kerr, and so I was real active in the bar. I was active in the Young Lawyers section. I was the president of the Young Lawyers section, and I later was president of the bar, and I was always interested in the connection and interested in convincing and encouraging the bar to support the programs. And
speak to your cohort at Emory Law School, because off tape before we began, you mentioned that you were contemporaries of a number of other people who got in.
Oh, I mean, you think about it. I mean, Bucky Askew, who is now on the Legal Services Board, was in law school with me, and his first job was working for Martin Huddleston, who also went to law school with me. Martin was the regional OEO and legal services person, and Bucky worked for him as his assistant. And then, of course, Bucky went on to work for NLADA and for the Legal Services Corporation, like maybe in the reverse order, for the Legal Services Corporation, then NLADA, before coming back here to Georgia. Ben Shapiro, who was one of the original founders of Georgia Legal Services, was in my class. Jim Elliott was a class ahead of me, and he and I have a long, close friendship from both college, law school, and from legal aid and the state bar activities. Bill Ide is another person that I was close to. He was the president of the Young Lawyers section of the state bar shortly before I was. Very involved in legal services program. Of course, John Cromarty was a college friend of mine and very active. Andy Sheldon, who worked in legal services, I think both at the Emory Clinic and maybe somewhere for Georgia Legal Services, was also a classmate of mine. Bill Brennan, a longtime Atlanta Legal Aid, now into sort of the lending scam, subprime lending, a lot of other stuff like that, was also a law school classmate. So I have a lot of connections from way back.
So there's a real cohort.
That's right. Real group of the usual suspects. Betsy Neely's another one. Betsy Neely was in law school with me and active in lots of different aspects of legal
Betsy
service.
Neely was in law school with you. She didn't go to Virginia?
Well, maybe you're right. I know Betsy then. It must have been after law school.
Well, I think she got a Reggie right after law school to be involved in the field.
Maybe it wasn't law school, but I certainly know Betsy and have worked with her in lots of different areas. Because my firm has several past presidents at Atlanta Legal Aid. Randolph Thrower was a past president. Baxter Jones was the past
Yeah.
president. John Chandler is the past president now. Judy O'Brien is the past president. John Chandler really came up with the idea for and got through the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation funding. He's the one that,
It was like volunteer lawyers for the arts and.
well, Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation is at AVLF, it gets a certain fee from the civil filings in the state court of Fulton County, and that was passed as a special legislative effort. Charlie Carnes was the dean of the Fulton County delegation. He was instrumental in getting that concept started, and it's been a terrific benefit to Atlanta, at least, in providing pro bono services for legal
It's interesting to me, these kind of creative fundraising initiatives that kind of come along down the pike over the years.
That's right, and we need more of them. I've got to go. Anything
Well-
else? I'll give you one last question.
Okay, if you could think of like one sort of experience that you had that sort of epitomizes your legal services, decades service or whatever, what sort of, clients or cases or epitomizing
Well, I
moments?
guess the most have been working with a Georgia Legal Services lawyer named Skipper Steitmoss in Athens, and with Mara Slattery and Wendy Glassburner and Bonnie Miller in a case involving the eviction of residents of a mobile home park in Athens,
Right.
Clark County, Georgia, called Garden Springs. And we, as a result of our efforts, first got a 5-6 month extension for the folks to relocate, and then we helped with government and private fundraising, provide $2,500 to each family, 70-something families, to help them with the relocation expenses. We have a contract to buy some land, and we've got title work done, and we're getting ready to do some surveying and environmental work and then some engineering work, and hopefully we'll be able to develop a tenant-owned trailer park to replace the one that was that they were ultimately relocated from, and that has been a wonderful experience. Incidentally, I'm also working now with Phyllis and several different lawyers from the Piedmont office in some negotiations involving a minority community in the city of Griffin or outside the city of Griffin in Spalding County, trying to get them sewer services. So that's another, and those have been great experiences.
We'll cut.
Okay? Thanks, guys. I'm sorry we had to rush through.